Hello, everybody. Denise here. Welcome to our RED program 34 review video. In this occasion, we're not having a meeting just because of the time. And so I decided to do it in this format this time, just reviewing the transcription of the program in Spanish, reviewing it with the highlights. I basically highlighted all of it because it's just very amazing. And yeah, so let's get through it, and hopefully you enjoy this material. So Alejandra begins the emission, of course, talking about lab 6, right? Right now we are on lab 7. Red program 134 corresponds to lab 7. So this last lab was lab 6, and she says that lab 6 is the lab that has to do with the system that interconnects us, that allows us to translate from the subatomic scale expression until the anatomic expression. So the system that interconnects us, right? It is very important. And especially in this year, the beginning of Aparato 507, right? Lab 6 of the first year of Aparato 507. So it is like the installation of that new system. So it is very a big deal. And when we're talking about 6, we're talking about the middle line, 4, 5, and 6, right? So Ale talks about the filter because she says, because so that the third dimension exists in linear time, we need oh, sorry. Sorry. For the third dimension to exist, we need linear time. And remember, linear time is a construction, right? It is an artificial construction of space-time. Linear time only exists at an anatomic scale. It doesn't exist at a subatomic scale, okay? And then I highlighted over here where she's saying, this is a planet where we are putting to the test. We're putting the solar code to the test in this orbital. Yeah. So each one of us is going to have different levels of anticipation or dragging according to their own space-temporal infrastructure, right? With all of these changes, with this new system, these new updates of the structure. So according to each particularity and each person's multidimensional structure will be the levels of anticipation or pushed around by life, by reality. Why? Because starting from 2012, the space temporal credit in Rho was cut short, was let go, right? What is Rho? It is a base programming that allows us to understand what linearity is, right? But starting from 2012, that ignorance license starts to diminish every year, right? And right now in 2025, it is as if we are each person to themselves. We cannot rely on supporting ourselves in Rho or in other people or in other people's reaches, in other people's anchors. We only can use what we actually have in our own re-axis, in our own anchor. So what is in execution right now? The quality of the particular space-temporal consciousness. Particular space-temporal consciousness. The quality of that is in execution. Do we have it or do we not have it? Subatomic scale consciousness. What is the quality of that? Do we have it or do we not have it, right? Now, the beginning of lab 7 is, it begins with element Berkelio. Remember, we are routing the elements along with every lab in Calendaria. So Berkelio we know the relationship between Oro and Berkelio, right? It has to do with the parabolic antenna, the connection with the space-temporal structures outside of the cycle, of the life cycle. So lab 7 begins with Berkelio, 97. Remember what mess I am in? Berkelio. Okay, so what is the mess I am in? Why do I need to ask myself this? Because we are all entering into the new system. From the most subtle aspect into the most anatomic aspect, right? Now, the thing is that if we have the administration of that subtle area, this whole thing will be very elegant. This whole transition, the change, the process will be elegant. But if we don't have that infrastructure, it probably won't be very elegant. And this is what in the market people call that the Black Swan or Black Monday, right? Where the market fell. On the day where this emission was recorded, the market had a Black Monday, right? Why? Because we need to use the gravitational logic that we have. So the quality of all of this is executing. And of course, all the credit in Rho is crumbling. We can see this. Oh, today, the Pope Francisco died. And today is Queen Elizabeth's native date. I mean, wow. Talk about breakages in Rho. It is pretty strong, pretty clear. Now, here it says, if this container hadn't been updating, we would probably right now be having all kinds and sorts of catastrophes. Now, these catastrophes have been announced, right, by people in the past, like Nostradamus, for example. But why do these catastrophes end up not happening? Because there are solar consciousnesses working with the code. So if there are solar observers working with the solar code and you know providing the support according to each observer's scope, of course, what's going to happen? The real time of Earth will begin to be to stabilize. So what does this mean? That the last day of lab 6, the frequency of the apparatus, of course, the year and apparatus, because we are in the Asume year, so it's the same, but not the same because, of course, the apparatus has a higher hierarchy than the year. That's why she's focusing on saying it is the positive frequency of the apparatus. And on the last day of lab 6, this positive frequency was 96. And the negative of the apparatus, what was it? 1365. Meaning that there's a receiver for the year. What is 365? It is all the positions in the orbital. That's 365, right? So whoever has captation can modulate the signals, of course. If you don't have captation, you don't modulate anything, you have no anticipation, you have no connection with anything that's going on. So of course, you're going to be your unfolded is going to be having a very hard time because it's not going to be understanding anything about what's happening around it. Now, here Alejandra talks about the nacido and the nativo, right? Now, the nacido, remember, the nacido is the aspect that is able to take in variables from the entorno in which it is projected, right? The nativo, it is the native octave that I have when I'm born. And that is it. That is what I have, right? But the nacido is the one that is able to have updates and make changes and include variables. So, but the nativo is always connected, of course, with the nacido. They're interconnected, and the nacido consumes the license of the nativo. This is what Alejandra is saying, right? The thing is that there may be a situation where this nacido nativo is either connected to the architect or not. If the nacido is connected to the architect, then it will be able to make new contracts and daily updates. If it's not connected to the architect, then it cannot do that. And in order to actually update, it needs to die and be born again. Now that's these are the potentials that are now available for us that we can do. Now, if we have that nativo and that it's the nacido connected to the architect. And then we can use the license of the nativo and also be updating every day. But we can only update every day only if we have solar consciousness. Here she says, the daily updates are only for the solar consciousnesses. For that, you need to have a consciousness of a subatomic scale in an active state. Your consciousness at a subatomic scale needs to be active in order for this to actually happen and function. And so whatever program we are using, before we could live like in the 400 apparatuses, we could live with our native octave all of our lives and not update at all. Now it is as if that credit is only daily, and and Alejandra says the program lasts 24 hours, but not even 24 hours. It lasts as long as you are awake, because when you go to sleep, there is a change, right? There is a scalar growth every night. When in the past it was like a whole life. That is a big change, right? And so why do this happens? Because something of a different scale is activated, right? Scalar growth. So scalar growth, in many cases, is being managed remotely. This growth is, in a lot of cases that maybe we'll be noticing, is being managed remotely, right? Which means that they are not doing, like they are not being the authors of this situation. So it's not that it's not gonna happen for everybody. Some are gonna do it by their own hand. Others are gonna be pushed to do this remotely, and slowly this whole thing will be modulated massively, and it's gonna be inducted. There's gonna be an induction to the change, right? Why? Because of course we know that the solar code does not want to lose its content, right? We want to have as many people alive in this transition. So reality has to use all of its mechanisms to make this transition. And one of those mechanisms will be that induction, right? That massive modulation to the change and induction. Why? Because the changes will not be voluntary, because the focus of most is not there, is not in that area. For many reasons, because maybe they don't have the framework contract, or they're distracted, or they just wanted the experience, etc. We've talked about this a lot. So the changes will not be voluntary, right? But the thing is that the context will be the one putting together the equation of equilibrium that the context itself needs, okay? So the context itself will be doing what it needs to do to structure that equilibrium equation, and it will move around whatever it needs to move around. The thing is that if we have certain lucidity and clarity at different scales, and we have certain concepts created, and we're modulating signals, then these changes, these movements that happen, a part of ourselves knows what's happening, even if we can't put words to it. There's a part of us that's going to be understanding what's going on, and that we're not going to enter into a state of panic. We're not going to be entering into anxiety or wanting to kill ourselves, because we're not understanding why all of the structures inside us and that supported the way our cosmovisions are just breaking, and because we have new ones, right? So that's in relation to that. So here she's saying, it is in real life where the octave is documented, right? In linear real life. Because, okay, before we are projected, we can have our native octave, we can make these attempts of interpreting, of making an interpretation. But once we are projected, that octave needs to be put into execution in this collective morphic field and into in interaction with others. So this is where the octave is documented and put to the test or expressed. So, and then she says, that octave is documented through the interconnection between barra tal and barra cual, right? So these two, of course, we have to learn what these two barras are separately. But of course, we must understand that they, of course, if things are functioning properly, they function together. If these concepts are created properly, then both of these functions in our space-temporal structures are going to be working together. So now, Baratal has to do with the fact that at a subatomic scale, there is no past, right? So in order for me to project myself into an existence that has linearity, that has past, present, and future, I need to contract with a past, right? With a group, with a certain group of people, which Alejandra calls the clan or the family, right? So if I'm a subatomic scale particle and I'm preparing to make a projection into a linearity, I need to contract a past so that I can insert myself in that specific space-time, right? Okay, so then she says, arreglario, the figure of arreglario comes from the subatomic scale. So it processes codes. It does not process experiences. So this is like a very important detail to have when we think about that figure of arreglario, our little human minds are going to think about, this character, this anatomic character. But it is like really good to make this differentiation of the detail that arreglario is a subatomic scale figure and it processes only codes and not experiences, right? So the arreglario part, the fixing part, is the fixing of the codes, not the experiences. The improvement of the experiences will, of course, come through the improvement or the fixing where the code needs that fixing. Now, barra cual 753 has to do with my maternal connection, okay? Why? Because it is as if I take this collective route, which is my mother's womb, right? To project myself, to install myself in this plane, right? But then when I am born, I am in SO. Right? I move to SO. I'm not in SE because I separate myself from my mother. So my mom, I go to SO, and for me, my mother remains in the SE cardinality. That's why my mother is always saying, hey, behave, you can do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, right? Why? Because it has to do with how others see me. So now this is the legal order. Remember, the legal order has to do with all the consensus and regulations that order or organize the morphic collective field in which we are projected. Because remember, in order to exist, you can't exist particularly. You have to exist through a collective space. And in this case, that collective space will be Sol, that's the star. So that legal order has to do with the fact that we are inserting ourselves into a field that is not particular, but collective. Okay, so that figure of Arreglario is at a subatomic scale. It has no past. So it's really hard for that figure to understand what's going over here, right? But if the identity is really anchored or really strongly placed in the anatomic scale only, this doing all of these things, like the modulation of this big change will be very difficult because it is not enough to only have a third dimension identity, right? Remember, we talked about this. We don't have to choose. We have a third dimension identity. We have an anatomic identity, a human identity, but that cannot be all the identity we have. We need to create an impersonal identity that lies outside of the human life cycle or the human experience, because that is what the human has. That scope, that extra scope or reach that the human has to do with the fact that we can reach the subatomic scale. That is like the big difference. That's why we can create and we can destroy. So a third dimensional identity will not be enough, right? We need to develop a belonging that is different than just anatomic, right? And this is something that was always in the potential. That's why we need to develop it. It's not the same to have a potential, right? I can see my potential, but I am not able to develop it. Now, if I am able to develop my potential, then it becomes a reality. I bring it down to the third dimension and I make it real, right? It doesn't stay abstract. Now, if I am not the author of my code, if I don't have an active architect, I'm gonna need to believe in something desperately. That's why people are so desperate in believing something. Why? Because they are disconnected from their architect. They are delegating that role, that very important administrative role of my own existence to an external, probably cosmic consciousness, right? I need to believe in something desperately. Why? Because I'm not interested in creating something from scratch. It's too difficult. So I would just rather use a code that's already been made. It's easier for me to use it. So then I have that base code that is not my own. So that becomes a belief system for me. It's a belief system. Why? Because I did not create it. I don't know who created it. I don't know how it was created or how it is created, right? But this structure is blind. Why? Because I don't want to reason. I don't want to, I'm lazy. I don't want to do I don't want to do the work. I want somebody to do the work for me. But the thing is that if the subatomic scale consciousness is awakened, that connection is awakened, then over here is what they call that connection, what they call the source. The connection to the source, right? The thing is that in this routing of these understandings, the mystical arguments are everywhere, right? So it's really hard to have an actual connection to the source because the connection to the source is highly technical. It's purely technical. It is not mystical at all. So if it's contaminated with the mysticism, of course, because it's such a subtle connection, it will be lost because it's very delicate. That's why Alejandra and also I am very I make a lot of emphasis in a very, very clear creation of concepts and leaving things that do not close, leave them open and not force them to close, because that is not good for the connection, for the subtle connection, right? It's very, very subtle and it can be lost easily. And if you lose that, you lose synchronicity. It's not fun to lose the synchronicity. So here she says, the technical scale is the only one that is needed to be able to make the framework agreements, the agreements with the frames. So we can only do that with the technical scale and not die trying. But if we're trying to do something like this with only symbolic consciousness, I'm probably not gonna make it. Okay, here Alejandra says that because in Argentina, she didn't need to use her second last name. When she went to Peru, they do it differently and they use both last names, right? So because the last name was not registered in any of her documents, what they did in Peru was put XXXX, right? Like empty or free, there's nothing, XXXX. So of course, with Alejandra's scope, she saw this and she was like, okay, what's going on? She realized that this situation meant that she was being used at a morphic field level as a public port because it was vacant. There was nothing there. She hadn't assumed that other part, that Wozniak part, that Barracual that had to do with the connection with the collective. There was nothing there. It was empty. So remember, if we leave something vacant, what's gonna happen? Some consciousness from outside that knows about these structures sees a vacancy and is like, oh, I can do my thing from there, like an open door, right? That's why she says a public port. So this is where she realized that she had to assume the Wozniak. And a very interesting thing that also happened to her is that when she did this, she went back to Argentina on the 4th of April. She modified her documents and her Mac computer was destroyed. Her, and the co-creator of Apple Computers, last name is Wozniak, and also Wozniak is a Ukrainian last name for Alejandra. Her grandmother was Ukrainian, and so she says, because why? Because the only infrastructure or the only help I can give to Ukraine is in the antimatter. So this is like very important, of course, and we are seeing how all of the instruction and everything that has been happening is now getting very close to Alejandra's personal area. Here's where she says, of course, I am not assuming something. I am missing something. And then here's where she says, my only apportation to the infrastructure that she can do for Ukraine is at a subatomic scale, right? So now, when she signs, she can now say MACW, right? The W was not there. So now, because M and W are outside and AC are inside, she's explaining here in code. Alejandra Wozniak moves the container. And Alejandra Casado, the content. Right? Why? Because it's from outside. So Maria Wozniak deals with the container and Alejandra Casado deals with the content. But then she says, I do not confuse the two roles. And she also has her global aspect and her personal aspect, and she doesn't confuse those either. This is like the beauty also of LGC. It allows us to separate and differentiate every single element so that we know when they are interconnected how each of that works. It's pretty cool. So now she talks about the Google Day of Lab 7, the first day of Lab 7, which is 45754. Remember, 5-7 is the gravitational, is the interpreter, the gravitational interpreter, gravitational logic. And then it is inside the 44. So that is what we have in Google Day. Google Day is related to the matrix, right? Okay. So beginning of lab 7, gravitational logic. What does this mean? The reading of this Google Day, it means that the gravitational logic will be executed with the solar code, strictly with the solar code. Why? Because these are the materialization rules in this local area of the universe. We are entering into a different area of the universe. So the gravitational logic needs to be executed strictly through the solar code. Now here she explains the difference between a magnetic configuration and an electric configuration, right? We're not saying that either one is better. No, of course, when they work together, that's best. But there's going to be some that have a more magnetic configuration, like more strong or more, yeah, pronounced. And there's others going to have a more electric. The thing is that if the configuration is more towards the magnetic, I'm going to be repeating something from the past. That's it, because I just want to relive something that happened in the past. It has to do with experiences based in memory units. That's the magnetic configuration. Now, if the infrastructure is not about repetition, but about reformulating, and not reformulating the facts, but reformulating the meaning of those facts to create an improvement, that means that I have to be disconnected from the magnetic. And this is something that Ale says that happened to her in 2012. She was completely disconnected from the magnetic order. Why? Because it wasn't about repeating, it was about reformulating the meaning of the facts to create improvements. But if I'm only in the magnetic, I can't do that because the magnetic is based, like axiomatically based in memory units. And here she says something about the neutral, right? She was disconnected from the magnetic and the formation in the electric order began, right? So now she can learn because she has the neutral. If she doesn't cut the magnetic, she can't have the neutral. If the magnetic is not, well, I don't know what she means by cut, really. But if that's like, if I'm only based in that magnetic configuration, then the neutral will not actually be neutral. It will be a repression. I'm gonna be repressing instead of actually being neutral so that I can begin a formation in the electrical order. It's gonna be like the neutral will be simulated. So it's not gonna be neutral, it's gonna be repressive, right? And so why am I repressing? Because the infrastructure will be from the brain down. That's like the limitation there. Okay, here she talks about DNA and RNA. So, okay, these variables of the Google Day. We have the beginning of lab 7. We begin with 97 in the apparatus. And then we have 575, 4 days of the Google Day, right? So here she says when she formalizes both of her last name, her computer died. And why does this happen? Because she says, I have to update the morphic field so that it reads me again and I can insert myself in it and read the variables. So she is not inserting herself in the morphic field blindly. There's a reconfiguration of, a previous infrastructure so that she can reinsert herself in there with the update. That's Ale. Hopefully we learn how to do all of this. Okay. So here she talks about the do, the nota do in the musical notes, right? The nota do is the one that has the intention of dominating the agenda in the gravitational status. See that she says dominating? When we talk about domain, we are always talking about an endogenous route, something internal. I can dominate my own scope. So she's saying here, dominating the agenda in the gravitational status. The agenda is very important because it has to do with linear existence, linear time. So we need an agenda, and that document is directly linked to that. Of course, we're all going to have an agenda, but that agenda, every gravitational document should probably be synchronized through the clave de sol, the solar code, so that the interactions in the SE cardinality can be executed in a symphony, right? So why does she say agenda? Because of course we have the letter D and we have the letter O. O is 1 with 6, and she has explained the relationship between 1 and 6 has to do with the agenda. Why? Because the biological object will have a captation. And if that captation is in function, it will have a captation of the next step, right? When we're talking about the gravitational document, okay, you have the reception of the next step in the agenda. But there's another layer to that. If that reception is online and it's managed by the architect, then there's a global perception of all of the program, not just my gravitational document, but all of the program, and also the next step. So if I'm connected to the architect, I can make a variation because I am able to be in contact with all of the program. If that doesn't happen, there can be no variation. And of course, she starts talking about fear. Mi e do, look at the code. Mi, 5, gravitational document. I'm gonna be really, really afraid, and it's gonna be scary for me because my gravitational or documental logic will not be my own. If it's not routed by my own architect, it will not be my gravitational documentation. Mi e do. It's not mine. So of course I'm going to be freaking out. I'm going to be panicking because it's not me. Of course. But if it is my gravitational logic, it's fine because it's the author of the document. I am the author of the document. But if I'm not the author of the document, I'm going to be based in belief systems. So a belief is not the same as a creation. See, in Spanish, we have creencia, which is belief, and creación, which is a creation. And a belief is a creation that is not my own. If I have to believe in something, then it's because it's not my own creation. The thing is that now that is available. I can do my own creation without having to believe in anything if I don't want that. So that fear has to do with me not being the author of the document. So of course I panic. So all of this all of this mystical content is an entertainment so that the particle is entertained inside a fiction that it doesn't control. When we see it this way, it really sounds scary. It sounds like so sad. Like just all this mystical stuff. It's entertainment to keep the particle from learning space-temporal notions, and keep them subrogated. So, one second. have a little bit of a cold, sorry. Okay, so here she starts talking about how the morphic field will finally be moving towards modulating an equilibrium, balancing itself out. And our aspiration is that it does this in an elegant way. But when Alejandra says in an elegant way, she means that the planet doesn't disappear. That's as elegant as we actually need something to be, something like this to be. But we're talking about, here she talks again about identities that are based on the memories of the container. If the identities are only based on that, the changes will be a little bit like obligated or forced, pushed, because this morphic field will be ordering the contents massively. And if these contents are fundamentally based on beliefs, then of course we're talking about creations that are not their own. And here she's saying that Sol is no longer providing credit for the content creators. It's providing credit for them for frames, for creators of structures, frames, meaning creators. So the ones that come here with license for content will probably have a very broad ignorance license as well. They will have a broad ignorance license to ignore all of this, right? In our case, we don't have those ignorance licenses, but it doesn't mean that we are superior or inferior, because these criteria are not relevant. It has nothing to do with any of that. The thing is that this critical infrastructure depends on the experts of that critical structure. So all these people that kept their resonance with LGC for 12, 13 years, she congratulates them because it means that they are connected with their architect and they are nourishing themselves based on space-temporal structures to take the reins of their gravitational document. So all of this has nothing to do with basing ourselves on scriptures that were written in an ancient past. Why? Because at a subatomic scale, such thing doesn't exist, right? From there, it's all about being, it's a consciousness that is outside of existence. So it can keep that existence updated, right? So here's what she says. The human species has this plus, and this plus is the access to the subatomic scale, right? That's why we can alter the cycles, because this is a part of ourselves that lives outside of the cycles. So this has nothing to do with angels or any mystical stuff, okay? Those mystical consciousnesses and contents are here to keep people entertained and so that they don't develop themselves space-temporally speaking. Beliefs do not work over here on LGC. They are not useful. That's why she thinks it's so important that all the people that resonated with this begin to realize what they participated in, because all of this implies a very clear interdimensional connection. And Alejandra's job is to help these people to assume this interdimensional belonging, right? Because this whole thing of, and this is what Alejandra says, like, she's talking about the people coming to the event now, right? She needs people to have their own pasts. Like, that's why she asks people to have gone to events physically, to the events, right? Because she needs people to have their own memories of this whole thing, because in the past there's a situation of injecting memories that were not our own to hallucinate past fake pasts was a mechanism used for manipulation, right? The injection of a fake past. This made people confuse something they imagined with something they experienced, right? So when this confusion happens and then it's put on the field, of course the behavior is not appropriate. So the logic in the antimatter is completely opposite than the logic in the matter, right? In the antimatter, it is the architect having an opinion on totality. And totality is like, yeah, okay, fine, okay, yes, it says yes to everything. But here in the matter, it seems as if we think of something and reality is like, no, 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 no. Welcome to matter, right? And this generates a lot of conflict in the processor because it wants the mechanisms that function in the antimatter, it wants matter to function the same way that antimatter functions. So this generates a lot of friction in the processor. But if we create the proper concepts, we can this problem starts to not be as strong, right? The thing is that we now have a lot of time to you know, pull everything apart and realize what it was that happened. Why? Because for Sol, the only thing that Sol is interested in is the progression of its own code, right? Therefore, what it wants is architects to drink from the nutrition of the space-temporal structures to be able to create code that improves the gravitational scale, right? We all want to, this is what we all want and desire, an improvement in the gravitational scale, right? The thing is that we need to be interested in the mechanisms that come previous to that improvement. If we're just focused on consuming that gravitational scale, we're not going to be participating in the creation of that. So of course, probably it's not going to be a very good quality. Now, if I place my processor on top of the brain, I can take all of those things as anchor and not be anchored, right? If my processor is under the brain, I'm going to be anchored. I'm not going to be able to use everything that happens to me, and I'm not going to be able to capitalize it. The processor needs to function outside of the cycle, not inside. And then she says, this is not self-help quotes. This is an education. We are in front of very big challenges and of interdimensional scale. Interdimensional scale challenges. So this is not self-help. This is space-temporal education. So the third dimension is a creation. It's not natural. It is a product of the secondary unfoldment, right? And it is the evolution of the particular scale. Particular and personal are not the same thing. We're talking about particular scale consciousness, right? It is another level that can provide contention and progression to this plane, right? First, to contain, then progression. We need to set the boundaries, the limits of something so that it can have a progression, right? Okay. So here she starts talking about Cuarentena Global 118. She projects 39 days, which is the ending of Cuarentena Global 118. It is May 21, May 21st. So she also says that we have 39 days for every single element up until 118, which is Oganesson, which has to do with the octave of the context, right? Okay, so why 39? Because for our solar system, we are the third orbital, and when we need to make an update here on 3, we need to make that update through the 9th orbital, okay? And then we need to implement that update through a program, which is 8, document the value of that program, which is 7. We need to document the value of that program inside the units of memory, which is 6. that are administrated 5, and then I have the reigns of the destiny in the area of execution, which is 3. Wow. So 118 times 39 is 4602, right? And that takes us to the 21st of May. And here we can see other metrics of that day. And the total of the LGC calendar is 33833, right? Which is precisely, what does this mean? That the third orbital would have all of the infrastructure to develop its own manifestation. And we're talking about all of the resources from 2012 and up, right? Meaning that the resources from 2012 and up will end up containing and expanding everything that happened previously inside the container. Wow. So this has to do with the future being in charge of the past, because we have all of these 118 elements and we have 39 for each one of those elements, right? So this is the antimatter being in equilibrium, and this equilibrium is manifested on the LGC calendar on that day. So what is this for? What is the use of all of this? So that the subatomic scale consciousnesses can program their trajectories inside the years that follow, inside the next years that are coming, right? It is as if they can get a passport to inhabit the future of this orbital, right? And we're talking about lucid consciousnesses without any ignorance licenses in the middle. So what is she saying? She's talking about souls that are the founders of the solar space. And that thanks to all of those cosmic scale content, now have a mature infrastructure to be able to manifest and offer at a subatomic scale materializations that are no longer blind. See, so it's not a bad thing. This whole cosmic situation is not a bad thing. We cannot skip it. It is part of the process, because thanks to that, we have a mature infrastructure now that we can offer to the subatomic scale. Remember, Alice says that she works for that market, for the subatomic scale market. Yeah, so there's an offering for that, so that the materializations are no longer blind. So 21st of May, we have the annual frequency of that day, 141 minus 224. 224 is also, it has to do with the periodic table, see? It's 32 times 7. The seven line levels of the table that are known socially, it's 224 with all the filled spaces and the updates, of course. So 32 times 7 is 224, which is and then 141, what does that mean? It is a model that can control the context. It can control the context if it takes those 224 spaces into consideration, right? So we have 106 spaces functioning in the antimatter, and then we have 118 spaces functioning in the matter. Those 106, we're talking about all the black and all the added spaces. But here we are not, Alejandra, she's not talking here yet about the 4 lines that were added, right? The 2 cloned ones and -1 and -2. She's not contemplating that, because if we contemplate that, we get 352, which is the 22 laps of Calendaria. Okay, so what is 106? 1 with 6 agenda, again, but we have the 0 in the middle. So what does this mean? It means that we have a solar criteria for the management of the agenda, because the agenda is the construction itself of linear time. Now, when we have these ignorance licenses, when we have these, well, Alejandra calls them LLA licenses, right? Remember, LLA is like primary unfoldment, direct projection. There is nothing in between. There's no infrastructure in between. It is just like a direct license, right? When these licenses are operative, everything can be broken, and we will not be realizing what we're breaking until we die. But if we die and we realize what we broke, it would be too late for that, right? because this is a scenario where the solar code is being touched by a cosmic infrastructure, by signals that are not going through the solar code. They go directly inside and then they break everything inside, right? So this is, again, this is not a bad thing, because it is not bad, because if this didn't happen, we wouldn't have any failures to base or invent a new code that is good and that is offerable into the expressed universe, right? So there is no way that we could skip going through all of this. So there are no good guys or bad guys. We only have space temporal challenges, and that's basically it, right? Now, every time an antenna is oriented to the memories of the container, it means that those architectures are not their own, right? So of course you can't change anything, because why? Because the changes have to happen online. And if I am only based on the memories of the container, of course that's not online, right? If perspectives that are outside of the box are not activated, the conditions inside of the box cannot change. Now here she's talking about the demagnetization of the memories of the container, which also has a very important impact on the biological programs, right? And for all the members that are not realizing what's happening, we're gonna have sterile divergences, such as gender dysmorphia, right? Why? Because the biological programs are being demagnetized. These biological programs were the ones that kept a structure that provoked a continuation of the species, right? But if these things are demagnetized, we are all like, why should I have children? Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? So it has to do with this. We start to notice like immaterial infrastructure, and the continuity of the species enters into, we need to argument it consciously. It's not going to run by biological programs like blindly anymore. There has to be an argumentation. The creation of meaning is endogenous, right? Here she's talking about 118, which is the public octave, which is Francio and Oganesson. Remember that line in the table? Okay, so 118 and 87. How do I respond to that public octave? The response capacity. Yeah, we've talked about this a lot. So that response capacity, that, the demands of the context will probably help me, well, if everything works properly, help me take new resources to my gravitational octave, so it gets potentiated. My gravitational octave becomes potentiated if I have a growth in my response capacity for that public octave, right? But the thing is that my response capacity for the context I need to be creating my own meaning to create that response, right? I shouldn't be responding just because I want to be applauded or because I want to be, I want to be seen. No, I'm not doing it because of that. I need to do it because I have my own meaning to do something like that. And if I am creating the meaning to create that response capacity for the demands of the context, then that's going to be capitalizing my gravitational octave. But that meaning has to be my own. So if I'm doing that, that octave is going to grow and grow and grow. And it's going to go through different stages. And my appetites to satisfy the demands of the context will change because it is evolving, right? It is evolving every time it sleeps and it opens its eyes, because it's changing its framework contract. It has a new radon 87, right? So the stimulations probably will change. The appetites will change in relation to the demands of the context. Why? Because other interests are being activated, because there is an evolution. So it is important that one has that one has that you have your own sense of meaning to provide that response, right? Because that is what's going to keep me in my own anchor and my own axis. If I don't have that, I am going to be dragged around. So instead of searching for approval, external approval, the internal approval needs to be there because an external approval has direct access to your chemical structure. So the approval has to be internal. And if your architect is strong, you will realize that you won't matter if the other person saw your message or responded or approved. It's not going to affect you at all. And this is where you will know freedom. So here Alejandra says she doesn't care about results. She cares about the quality of the processes. Because if there's a lot of us focused on the quality of the processes, what's going to happen to the Earth? The Earth is going to rotate slowly. And what's going to happen if the Earth rotates slowly? We will notice things functioning in high resolution, in HD. But if we are still focused on the results, the processes are shitty, and we delegate everything to AI, right? And that's only going to prove how stupid you are. But there's a risk in all of this, but of course it's also an opportunity, right? It is a very high risk. It is the highest risk we have. But if we don't control the filter, the 5-4, because to administrate the model expands or contracts possibilities, right? The controlling of the filter. So 54 is to administrate the model. Do I administrate the model? If I do, then I am contracting and expanding possibilities at will. I am managing the processor of signals, and it has nothing to do with the brain, right? Because the brain will be executing whatever the architect determines, which has to do with the control of the gravitational octave. But this begins in a different instance than the brain. The brain only executes what the architect determines. So here Alice says that enthusiasm is something very strong. It's something that it's growing, but it shouldn't overexcite us. It shouldn't overdraft us. On the contrary, it should consolidate our anchor, right? And we're also going to be noticing a lot of people and how it looks like when people leave their gravitational octave without a a rider. Just let it run on its own. Which in the plane translates into people being guided by AI in how to kill themselves or how to provoke a disbalance outside, right? But we have to understand that this whole thing, it's about whether or not we are able to get through the filter of the dismantling of reality. So we have to be very close to delirium, getting very close to delirium so that we can take a step back and realize that we can also move forward. We can move forward, but we can move backward from delirium. But being close to delirium will help us understand what delirium is and will help us take a step back from that. Okay? Again, this is not therapy, this is space-temporal education. And it's LGC. It is an instruction that began on October 14th of 2012. It is progressive, it is incremental, and it develops us interdimensionally in a very slow way that nobody notices. Only you notice. Yeah, so things are changing, octaves, right? And a lot of people are gonna notice something happening where the key piece that allowed them the game of repetition is no longer there, and now they have to be introduced into a change, right? So they will begin this process in a non-voluntary way. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to lose their anchor because maybe they supported themselves in other people, and these other people are migrating their octaves and they are not supporting them anymore. Now, what's going to happen with those people? They're going to lose their anchor. So they're going to throw fits. They're going to be angry. They're not going to like it. because there's other people that determined changes at a subatomic scale beginning from 2012, and these people are more anchored, more stable every day, more consistent, and this is progressive, and it's not going to stop. So here she talks about how it is impossible for her to propose to her architect to do something repetitive, because she has to be completely present, completely enthusiastic, completely in the registration area. Because if it's not like that, with that level of presence, the task is not sustained. It has to be completely online. And then she talks about limitation, something that she saw at the gym where people were saying to her that, oh, we love to break the limits. And Ale says, well, I love to expand my scopes. It is a completely different paradigm. And then she says here, I am not in conflict with limitation. Limitation introduces more variables inside my scope. So I don't want to lose the connection I have. And so we're talking about a membrane between the limit and the scope. We've talked about this a lot. The membrane between the limit and the scope. If I respect this membrane, the limit, which is the architect itself, she's saying here that the architect is the limit itself, will be introducing new scopes if I am respecting that membrane, right? So my scope will be incrementing, and of course my domain will also be incrementing, because the architect is the limit itself. Do I want to break the architect? No, I do not want that, because that is the transgression that takes us away from domain. And I don't want to lose that, right? So I don't want to break the architect. I don't want to break any limits. I want to respect the limits and work in the membrane between my scope and my limit, because my architect will be able to introduce new scopes. It makes more sense, right? I mean, okay, so here she says that the Wozniak is like the maternal line with the barracual, and it directs her to a collective field, because she needs to emphasize now and how the other person needs her to say these things and not force others to see things the way I see them, right? So she's saying this is an ability that she is developing slowly and millimetrically. But every millimeter that is expanded, it is a lot, because it is a millimeter that is interconnected with totality. So you don't lose the synchronicity. Okay, wow. That is it, you guys. Amazing. I felt really great. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot because I think this is the third time I go over the material. The first one was with the video, and then I read it again to highlight, and then read it back to you guys. I thought it was really cool. I love doing this. I just really love doing this, because it's just every time we see more details and things become more and more clear, right? So yeah, it's really great. So thank you so much, guys, for being on the other side. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this material. Okay, see you soon. Bye.